It's finally out! Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes is the latest and greatest book from Wizards of the Coast for 5th edition D&D to grace the shelves of your local game store. With a focus on creatures from the multiverse and the planes they live in, this brand new book brings us to places and worlds we've never seen before, at least in 5th edition D&D. But is it really all that great? Well, find out today in this episode of Need or Greed. Hello and welcome to my official review of Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. My name is Josiah, also known as Dungeon Dad, and today we're going to be taking a look at just what this new book has to offer. Right out of the gate, I just want to say that I was extremely hyped up for this book and I was ready to fall in love with it, but I found that I didn't really love it as much as I wanted to. I do really like it, but to contrast that with Volo's Guide to Monsters, which it's going to be impossible not to compare this release to, I wasn't really as excited for that book and it ended up being a favorite of mine. So going into this, expecting to love this book, it actually came as a bit of a shock that it wasn't an instant classic, at least for me anyways. But I'll explain all of my thoughts and opinions on this as we go on. The book itself is divided into two separate sections. The first of which is all about lore and different locations and the creatures that live there and how they interact with one another. And the second half is a bestiary containing all those brand new shiny stat blocks. So what we're going to do is cover both halves of the book separately, and I'm going to tell you what I love from each section and what I didn't like as much, and then at the end I'll kind of wrap it all together and give you my verdict on this brand new product. So covering these two pieces in the order in which they are presented, we are first going to talk about some... The first half of this book is all about lore and backstory about a few different specific parts of the multiverse. That is very much the going theme in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. In case you weren't already aware, it is very much about the multiverse and the creatures who live there. The multiverse, of course, meaning things that are not confined to the prime material plane. It presents each chapter using the concept of the grand balance as a framing device. Each chapter, save for one of them, is about two or more opposing factions and how those different factions interact with each other, and how if one of those factions were to kind of get a foothold over the other, it could send the entire multiverse into chaos. That idea brings us to a few really interesting places and presents some different creatures in a way you may not have looked at them before. It covers the blood war between demons and devils, the schism that was caused between the elves and the many different kind of sub-races of elf that we have and why they are the way they are. It talks about the conflict between the dwarves and the Duergar, who are basically dark dwarves. Of course, there's a big section about the Githyanki, the Githzerai, and their conflict with the Mind Flayers. And the one chapter that isn't about war and creatures doing terrible things to each other is all about halflings and gnomes. Similar to the way Volo's Guide to Monsters was laid out, each of these sections goes in depth about the creatures and the relevant location and kind of gives us a bit of a story about what's going on with all of these beings. For example, the section about demons and devils, which is how the book opens up, is very interesting and actually presents a highlight from this section of the book. Of course, it talks about how demons just want to destroy, and they're this big force of chaos that would take over the entire realm of existence if given the chance, and the devils are the ones who kind of sit on the doorstep of the infinite layers of the abyss. While these creatures are lawful evil and yes, they steal souls and do all that stuff, they view themselves almost as protectors of the multiverse, because if it weren't for them and their constant war against the demons would rise up and destroy everything. So they have this very interesting sense of pride about how they protect literally everything, even if they don't necessarily do it in the nicest way. In their opinion, the denizens of the good aligned planes just aren't really willing to do what is necessary to keep people safe. And of course, safety for the Society of Devils means absolute rule and order. But going on from there, my problem with this half of the book is that it does cover a lot of information that we probably already know. Pretty much the entire section on Gith can be found through a quick skim of the D&D Wikipedia articles on Githyanki and Githzerai. Granted, each one of these sections, similar to the way Volo's Guide to Monsters had, does include different random tables for randomly generating certain NPCs for a Githzerai or a new demon lord or whatever you want. But aside from a few bits of flavor here and there and a couple new ideas, there really isn't a ton of brand new information. Now, if you're totally new to D&D and you don't know much about the difference between dwarves and Duergar or the schism that caused the separation between most elves and the Drow, this stuff will probably be very interesting to you. And like I said, there are a few bits of information here and there that I didn't know or that I thought, oh, that's a neat new idea. but ultimately, if you're a D&D veteran, you probably know a lot of this stuff already. I just didn't find this as interesting as the lore and ecology section that you find in Volo's Guide to Monsters. Now again, this could very well just be my personal preference, but when I went into Volo's Guide, I thought I knew everything about kobolds and hobgoblins and giants. But by the end of that book, I was really excited to run some of those more mundane creatures because it presented them in a new and exciting way, and I was genuinely stoked to put them in my game. I didn't have that same feeling after reading through this half of Mordenkainen's tome. But like I said, if you're not super familiar with a lot of these story elements already, you probably will enjoy this very much. Just don't expect it to totally reverse the way you look at elves or demons. But even if you are already familiar with this stuff, it is at the very least an entertaining read. It is extremely well written. You also do get a lot of very beautiful art scattered around, like pretty much every page has something interesting to look at, which is always nice. And you do get new rules for playing characters from a couple of different subclasses, as well as the new Githyanki or Gazerai race, which is really good to see as well. So overall, this section of the book is very well put together and has a few entertaining highlights. But just be aware, if you're pretty familiar with a lot of the basic D&D lore, you're gonna come across some lengthy sections that are covering things you probably already know. All that aside though, I know lore and world building isn't necessarily what every one of you wants this book for, and for many of you, the meat of the book is going to be the stat blocks. So without further ado, let's take a look at the boasting over 100 creature stat blocks. The new bestiary in this book was very exciting to me. There are a ton of new creatures, a lot of which actually are conversions from past versions of D&D, so it was cool to see some old favorites make their way over. It was nice to see those updates, which actually included 7 different creatures that I've covered on Monster of the Week, so just be aware, I'm on to you, Mike Merles. One thing I did find a little bit disappointing about this section of the book is that just over a dozen of these creatures are actually just reprints from the Out of the Abyss module. They included stat blocks for all the big, powerful elder demons like Demogorgon, which is fine, but it was a little bit underwhelming to see a significant part of the new monsters were actually just reprints of these big bad demons that I've seen before. This was especially frustrating just because these demons make up a significant portion of the really high CR creatures from the stat blocks. So if you haven't played Out of the Abyss and you don't own that module, that's fine. All these stat blocks will be new to you. But if you already have Out of the Abyss, again, just be aware you're going to be paying for some content that you already own. And on the topic of higher CR monsters, there aren't too many of them in this book. At least not too many new ones, discounting the 8 or so demon lords. This can be both a good and bad thing depending on what kind of game you're running. If you're not running a high level game, then that's fine. This isn't going to really bother you too much in any regard. But if you were hoping for stat blocks for Asmodeus or Mephistopheles or any of the archdevils really, I think you'll find yourself a little disappointed because there are only 3 archdevils statted in this book, and only one of them is technically a current archdevil. The other 2 were downgraded with the new ordering in the Forgotten Realms lore. These numbers also seem a little bit padded when there are over a dozen stat blocks for Dro and Duragar alone, which again, isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if you're running a game and you don't plan on using Dro or Duragar, that's another significant chunk of the stat blocks that you're just not even going to look at. But if you are planning on using one or both of those types of monsters in your D&D campaign, then that's fantastic. You're going to have a bunch of material to work with. Which brings me to my next point, which isn't so much a flaw, but just something to be aware of. A lot of these creatures are extraplanar, which should be obvious given the whole theming around the book, but just be aware that if you aren't planning on using creatures from other planes or going to other planes and experiencing adventures there, you're not going to find this book as useful as someone who is doing those things. But all that said, if you do have plans to go to other worlds in your D&D campaign, or you just have plans to bring those creatures to the material world, then this book is going to be fantastic for you. There's a lot of really good stuff in there. Plus, they brought back the GIF, so huge bonus for bringing a creature on from Spelljammer. Overall, despite a few minor disappointments, I do think this book is a genuinely fascinating read, and it does add a lot of really cool creatures to the game. If you're new to D&D and you have plans to use any extraplanar creatures, or you're just looking for something outside of the 2 monster books we already have, I would absolutely recommend Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. If you're a veteran, I'd still recommend it, although with the caveat that you're gonna see a few creatures that you already know from Out of the Abyss if you own that module, and in the lore section you might see a lot of redundant information that you're already aware of. But all that aside, what do you think? If you've had a chance to look over this book and you have an opinion, please leave a comment and tell me how right or wrong you think I am. After all, I'm just a dude who likes D&D and there are tons of different opinions out there, so I'm curious to know what you guys think. Also, something I'm thinking of doing in another video is going over the stat blocks of creatures in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes that I had already done conversions of and just comparing and contrasting and see how they stack up. So if that's something you'd be interested in, please let me know as well, because I, for one, am a little curious. But anyways, guys, I just want to say thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one. Till then.